Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing okay. Looks like I'm on the Death Star. Yeah, people are a lot nicer than you would expect here. They're actually just like working in any office. Who knows if they're blowing up planets, but they're quite nice. Anyway, hope you're doing well. Hope you had a nice weekend. We've got 2 more days of classes. Well, I guess 3, including tomorrow, but we'll be done this week. And that means that it is going to be time to take our final exam, and it will be set up very much like your midterm exam. In fact, what I will do is show you that information right now. So we'll do it the same way as before. You will be given 3 days to take the exam. So I'll at midnight, oops, yeah, 12, oops, sorry, that was not right. There we go. Midnight, Thursday night. So starting, Friday at midnight, you'll be able to take the exam all the way through Sunday at midnight. So that will give you 3 days again. It's any 80-minute period. Once you start, you have to finish, and that's absolutely that's got to be written in stone, because what we don't want is people stopping the exam and looking up answers and all that sort of thing. So that's very, very important. Please make sure again that you are at a good connection. And in terms of the coverage, it will be everything since the last test, everything since the midterm, including all our discussion sections since the midterm. And I think there was also one section that was right before the midterm that was on touch that you should also take a look at. And I'm pretty sure those are the sections that will be covered. I don't know if Dylan is with us now, but I will confirm this with Dylan if he's not, just to make sure that all of these things were covered. There'll be a section tomorrow, of course, and I'll make sure that I'm certain of what was covered in that. So I will double check this with Dylan and let you know by Thursday. Certainly the exact discussion section material that will be tested on this final. All the book material through touch and through the epilogue. There's a couple of things in the epilogue that we will ask about, so make sure you read through that. As before, same exact format, about 60 questions. It will be open book, but it must be taken alone. And again, once you start your 80-minute period, you must finish within that single 80-minute period. As you know, certainly now from the midterms, it's important that you do study. Even though you will have some chance to look up answers on questions that you're unsure of, you certainly cannot look up the answers to all of your questions. And it's some of the questions you'll already know because of the practice questions in our lectures. So it should be very straightforward. Most of you did tremendously well on the midterms, so I'm expecting you to do well on the finals as well. Okay. Oh, there will be a little review again tomorrow at the end of the section. I'm going to ask Dylan to just reserve 10 minutes. And I realize that is before, a number of days before the test. But if I were you, if you have any questions, I would look through the material tonight, at least what we've gone through so far and what's in the book, and come in with questions. Dylan is not going to be reviewing any lectures from scratch or anything like that. He's just there to answer your questions for the last 10 minutes. And hopefully you'll have some. If you don't, then we'll end discussion section early. Okay, so let me take a couple of seconds to see if there's any questions on the last exam. Again, it's not cumulative. It will count, about as much. All we do is we just add up all the questions and how many points you got. So there'll be about 120 questions total between the midterm and the final. And how many points you got, look at how everyone else did. And you got a good sense of how you're doing in the class based on that rough grade range. Of course, we will be adding pluses and minuses and looking to see how everyone else did as well. Okay, so it will count as much. It's not cumulative. It'll be very much like your midterm. Any questions, please feel free to either chime in with your voice, or you can put them in chat if you have anything. Anything? All right, no problem if you don't. Okay. All right. Maybe you'll have some on Thursday. I'll go through this material again on Thursday. I think everything's been working fine. I think the videos are up. I think I've been keeping current with the videos. We will probably skip around a little today to make sure I can get through all the topics, which means I might have to skim over a slide or two, but I will let you know, of course, pretty much everything that is covered in today's lecture, at least, is also covered in the book pretty directly. So you'll have a chance to read about that if you see a slide that's been posted, but I haven't had time to cover in the lecture today. You can go to the readings for that information. Okay. If there's no questions, then let's continue with our discussion of faces. So this is where we left off. So just to remind you where we started with faces, we decided that faces is a class of stimuli that the human brain is especially sensitive to. And we exemplified that through our discussion of the uncanny valley, the situation in face portrayal, either in movies or videos, or especially in video games, where it is exceptionally hard to render a human face as realistic, to the point where it isn't something that seems a little eerie. And the closer it gets to seeming realistic, unless it's perfect, it will seem, kind of scary. You saw that in The Polar Express as the fine example. And I mean, it's an interesting story. And I think that the added story of what's now happened in computer animation of faces and that sort of thing adds to it. But even after the success of Benjamin Button, they're still having problems. I mean, it's not like they've solved the problem completely. There's still instances where a deceased actor is resynthesized, and sometimes it seems like it works, and other times it seems just eerie. So it is that hard, and it really does attest to the sensitivity the human brain does have to faces. And part of the reason we believe that the human brain is so sensitive to human faces in particular is because of all the information that the face provides and how quickly it provides that information. I mean, we need a way of being able to quickly extract information about what other people are like, what other people intend towards us. And it's important that the face be something that all that sort of information is detectable on. And so we talked about this in the context of facial expression and how quickly we seem to be able to extract information about faces. In fact, we can do so even if we aren't consciously aware of seeing the face. So we've been talking a lot about these subliminal presentations of face stimuli, and even if we don't know we're seeing a face on a computer screen, the brain seems to be able to use information for that face. So it can influence aesthetic judgments of other objects like the Chinese characters and hypothetical decisions and mood. And then we talked about the fact that part of the reason why we might be so efficient at processing facial expression information is that we do seem to do some sort of kind of subtle imitation of facial expressions. And we ended up talking about that at the end of the last lecture. So when we look at faces that are expressing some emotion, we engage our own facial muscles to very subtly emulate that expression. Now, sometimes it is something that can be seen if a video is taken of somebody looking at faces, or photographs are taken of looking at somebody at faces, at expressing faces, which you're seeing there. But even if the kind of reflexive response of those muscles isn't extreme enough to actually be seen in a photograph or in video, there's other ways of doing this, and that can be through measuring the muscle activity. So that seems to be something pretty systematic. When you look at an expressing face, the muscles that you would use to imitate that face are engaged. And it suggests that, that this can be induced subliminally. It can possibly have small influences on emotion. And later on, we'll talk about instances where people are actually constrained in their ability to do that kind of implicit kind of imitation, and it will affect how well somebody can perceive somebody else's expression. So constraining one's own expressions, putting a pen in the mouth, a pen in the teeth, can influence how that person then perceives somebody else's expressions. We'll see some interesting examples of that when we get into imitation in just a few minutes. But let's continue talking about perception of faces. And what I'd like to do next is a little demonstration for you, where I'm going to show you pairs of faces. And as you'll see, the faces are very, very similar to each other. But I'm going to ask you which of the pair characterizes a personality type more. So you can just look through these and maybe take a note, in your notebook or, on your computer or something like that. And we'll, it's really for demonstration purposes. Let's see if it works for you. It's very subtle differences, you'll see. So this has to do with personality. Yeah, okay. Before I actually do the demonstration, I just need to give you a little bit more background. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. Personality from faces. And that's really what we're after here. So when we look at a face, especially a face that's a little bit older, okay, like mine, there seems to be things that we can extract about personality. Now, I should say that, you've been taught not to judge a book by its cover. You've been taught, not to go with first impressions of people. People can really surprise you, and that's one of the wonderful things about, our social lives. I'm sure we all know people that, had a kind of a look that really didn't characterize who they were, and that, it's really kind of striking when that happens, and it's, often a pleasure when that happens. But it's like our brains can't help but make judgments, and it probably serves an evolutionary purpose that when you look at somebody, you're extracting some information to the point where you try to kind of make you try to get an impression of who they are socially, personally, in order to know how to interact with them. Is this somebody who's threatening? Is this somebody who's accepting and looking for a connection? That sort of thing. There are evolutionary reasons why our brain should be set up to do that. Of course, we might be wrong, and very often we are, but let's talk about how that happens, and ultimately whether or not that quick extraction are sometimes correct. So our impressions are formed so quickly. So you look at a face, and within 1/10 of a second, you can then try to infer their personality, and you stick with it too. I mean, without talking to them, when you look at somebody, I like to do this at a coffee shop. When I'm in a coffee shop writing or something, I do a lot of my writing at coffee shops. I'll look up, and somebody will walk into the coffee shop, and when I'm kind of daydreaming or something, I'll look at them and say, okay, based on what I see right there, I would say that person is, has a kind of kind disposition. They are so educated. They, have had a happy life, these sort of things. And I know it's not something we're supposed to do, but it's something kind of our brains always do. And again, I know often I'm wrong, but the first impressions are quick. And until I talk, get to know the person, they last. And that's true of all of us. Those impressions will last. Now, there is some evidence that when we are looking at an older face, that we can be correct to some degree. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But why might that be the case? All right, so if I ask you which of those two faces, the woman on the left, the woman on the right, had an easier life, not easier, maybe a happier life, maybe a more fulfilling life. These two women were just asked to look into the camera and not to express happiness or sadness or anything, just look neutrally into the camera. And I think as I look at this, I would say maybe the women on the left, okay, seem to have a happier, maybe, easier, more relaxed life. The woman on the right looks a little bit more strained, maybe a little bit more I don't know, sullen. I don't know what the word is, right? And we'll talk in a second about there's some evidence that actually that our impressions can be true. But yeah, I would say this woman looks a little bit like she would, if I had to make a guess, and I know I'm not supposed to, but if I had to make a guess, I would say this person on the left maybe that's the case in this. Well, this one on the right here, this is my mom. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, my mom had, I was her child. She had a very, very easy, happy life. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, why might that be the case? Why might we, in fact, kind of display something about our personality in faces? Well, one possibility is this. One possibility is that we might our personalities might grow into our faces, kind of an interesting idea. So, you've maybe known people that just their resting face had a little bit more, I don't know, looked a little sullen than other people's resting face. And based on that, okay, maybe, people interacted with that person a little bit differently. So if you have that resting face that looks a little bit more, I don't know, unapproachable, right? Then people are going to be less likely to approach you, and that might affect your personality. So in fact, you end up kind of growing into a personality that might be a little less approachable. That phenomenon where your personality kind of grows into your face would be an example of a term you may have heard from other classes, a self-fulfilling prophecy. It just means that, you have a certain look, and because of that certain look, people kind of treat you in a certain way, and that then affects your personality. If I have a resting face that is a little less approachable, people will approach me less, okay? And that might affect me to be a little bit more standoffish. Okay, so I'm kind of, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way. If I'm, on the other hand, if I have a face that smiles a lot and is very animated, people might approach me, and I might then my personality might grow into that face and be affected by my appearance. That would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is one reason why that might occur, why our faces, why our appearance might tell people something about our personality. That is one reason. I'm going to tell you the second reason in just a second, but there's a question down here. Yeah, Ivy agrees that the person on the left is a little bit easier going looking. I think most people would say that. And it's interesting because the other reason why our faces might tell people about who we are is this. Let me see if I can, how I should tell you this story. Let's talk about this experiment first. So the truth is, I'm going to put up these terms here for you, expressive habits, but I'm going to talk about these elderly faces. These are actually these are actually stimuli in an experiment in which people, women came in, elderly women came in, looks like they're in the 60s, 70s maybe. They came in and they were asked to sit for a portrait where their faces were neutral. Their faces were expressing happiness and sadness, and pictures were taken of them. And then in addition to that, these women filled out a questionnaire. And the questionnaire was about their personality. What was their life like? What has their life been like? Would they consider themselves a happy person? Would they consider themselves a more serious person? That sort of thing. And this was a kind of a nice way of establishing these stimuli, where not only can you show these faces now to naive subjects, but then you can ask about personality to see if people were correct. And what was found in the experiment is, with these stimuli, with these women that were older, there was a correlation between what people thought of their personality simply by looking at their faces and their actual personality. So maybe in this example, this person did report being a little bit more serious, maybe having a little bit more hardship in her life than this person, okay? And again, this is based on both, people expressing, asked to smile, asked to frown, but especially with these neutral faces, which I think in some ways is the most interesting example. Yeah, people were not terrible. Like, naive subjects came in, were making judgments of these faces, and they were not terrible with it. Now, this is with elderly faces, and clearly there's, these faces are not just, these pictures are not just showing the faces, they're showing a little jewelry, they're showing the hair, looks like they're showing a little bit of the clothing, and all those things could play a role, whether or not, subjects are instructed just to look at the faces. You have to, be very kind of, careful with what you're showing subjects when you're asking them to make judgments like this. But still, it's a provocative finding that at least something about these personalities can be determined. Now, why is that the case? Well, one would be the idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. It could be that this woman always had a resting face that was a little bit more serious than this woman. And for that reason, even when she was a little girl, when this woman was a little girl, she had a more serious face than this woman. And people are maybe approached her a little less often because of her serious face. This woman maybe had a little bit of a happier resting face, and people approached her more often, and that kind of led her to have a more gregarious personality, maybe a more, light personality than this person who had less people interacting with her. That would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. An alternative explanation would be this, that because of the life events that she's had, okay, maybe she, struggled, in her wherever she grew up. Maybe, she grew up in a more impoverished situation, maybe with more conflict, maybe in a, in a political climate that was much more stressful than this woman, something like that. Who knows? There's lots of things that can affect people. That she really didn't smile as much, that, there was a lot of worry in her life. And that worry was expressed on her face again and again. And what happens when, your face goes through, expressing worried often, is it changes the structure a little bit. These are called expressive habits, right? So this woman would, because of her harder life, express concern, express worry, where this woman had less worry and maybe more, pleasure. Maybe her life was easier, more happiness, and she would express happiness more. Okay. Basically, your faces, yes, there's skin, and that's going to be reflected in wrinkles, but below that, it's all muscles. And when your face goes through, the same sort of movement again and again, you're exercising different groups of muscles depending on whether you're frowning more or smiling more. So based on the actual events in your life, you're basically exercising your face in different ways. And just like, when you look at The Rock, who clearly exercises a lot, it's not just when he's exercising and making his muscles that you see he has muscles. It affects his body, so he always looks, like he's worked out, right? The same thing is true of your faces, right? So especially as you get older, that the structures of your face can be affected by how much you've expressed sadness versus happiness. So that's another explanation, and it could be, a combination of both, certainly, both self-fulfilling prophecy and expressive habits. But think about your face as being shaped by a group of muscles that have been exercised in different ways throughout your lifetime. And that's especially going to be apparent in, 70 years worth of exercise, so that the resting face of this woman, because she's possibly frowned more often, okay, would look a little sadder than the resting face of this woman because she smiled more. So faces show exercise, just like The Rock's body shows exercise. And that might be one of the ways that, to the degree we can do this, we can judge personality from faces. This might be the basis or part of the basis. Okay. All right, but as I said, first of all, these are older faces, right? These are faces that have wrinkles, and I should mention wrinkles are also going to be influenced by expressive habits, right? You know, people that have very prominent laugh lines or very prominent worry lines. We might look at those elderly faces and judge something about their personality based on that. But what about younger faces? What about faces that are from people your ages? And what if we start taking out all this stuff? We take out the hair, we take out the clothing, and just show the face. And here's the demonstration. I apologize for not getting the order right. The demonstration I'm going to show you now is pairs of faces, and you're going to see their younger faces. You're going to see their younger faces that are very, very similar. But I'm going to ask you to try to guess the personality of these very, very similar faces. So basically what I'm going to show you was kind of a follow-up experiment to this experiment to see, now let's kind of restrict everything. Let's use younger faces. Let's use very similar faces, and now see if people can still make personality judgments based on, you know, their true personalities, just from looking now at very, very carefully shown faces. So let's do that. So which of these two faces do you think is of somebody more agreeable? The person on the left or the person on the right? And you can just write it down. You don't have to tell me, but just make a note of it. Is the person on the left more agreeable, or the person on the right more agreeable? Okay. Which is more conscientious, the person on the left or the person on the right? I know they're very similar. There's not a lot of difference between them. You can see that, but you know, you can see some difference. And just what's your first impression? Is the person on the left more conscientious, or is the person on the right? Would you be more likely to trust a task to the person on the left or the person on the right? Who is more extroverted? The person on the left or the person on the right? Okay. Which would you be more likely to imagine somebody coming up to you at a party or a coffee shop or something? Who's more neurotic, the person on the left or the person on the right? Who do you think worries a little bit more? My face doesn't count. Person on the left or the person on the right, okay? And who's more adventurous? Who do you think is more likely to, you know, travel and try new things, the person on the left or the person on the right? And then the last one, you're going to see is a little odd, but it was part of a follow-up experiment. So I'm going to present the stimuli to you. Who is more open to casual sex, the person on the left or the person on the right? Who is more open to that sort of thing? Okay. All right. Now, we're going to go through all these, and I'm going to tell you how the experiment was constructed. So we're going to go back to our slide. And here are the images we just saw. And these are clearly younger faces. These are faces of undergraduates who were taken in a lab. But I should say they were created in a very, very interesting way. Now, these things I asked you about: agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism, openness to new experience. You may have heard of this before. I mean, if this is your first psychology class, no, but if you've taken other psychology classes, including like an introductory class or something, this is a well-known personality test called the Big Five. And the idea behind the Big Five is it's a very simple, very easy personality test to give people. And it kind of establishes people's personalities on 5 different dimensions, and there are the dimensions right there. And there are a lot of folks in my department, especially, my department's a kind of known personality psychologists in my department are known to be real fans of the Big Five. They believe that there's a lot, you know, that you can capture much of a person's personality with these dimensions. That this can be used to kind of evaluate personality, so they can be used in tests of things like face perception and whether we can perceive these dimensions in faces. Okay, so here's how it worked. Let's say 100. Yeah, actually, let's just talk about the women. You can see there's men on the right here too, but let's just talk about the women. 100 women come in to the lab. The first thing they do is they have their picture taken, just like this. And you can see, yeah, you can see their hair here, but the hair is clearly homogenized. There's nothing distinctive about the hair of these two individuals across the two individuals. Okay, fine, good. Same with the clothing. You're really seeing faces here. They are very much more controlled, these images, than the ones that were taken of the older women. Okay, cool. Now that they've had their picture taken, they go through this little inventory called the Big Five. And, you know, there's questions on it like, how often do you worry? That would be for neuroticism. Do you find yourself agreeing with your friends? And it's not more than one question per dimension. There's, I don't know, like 50 questions on it. I think there's 10 questions per dimension. You know, are you likely to go up to somebody at a party? Are you good at maintaining conversation? That would be for extroversion, something like that. You get the idea. And so the researchers not only have pictures of these people, they have, you know, their scores on each of these different 5 dimensions of personality. Okay. Now, get this. What they do is based on the ways that people answered these questions, based on people's score on agreeableness, conscientiousness. Out of the 100 women, they take the folks that had the highest score on agreeableness, the 10 faces that had the highest score on agreeableness, and the 10 faces that had the lowest score on agreeableness. And basically using a facial morphing technique on Photoshop or some computer program, they basically merged together the 10 most agreeable faces and then merged together the 10 least agreeable faces. And the way they merge them together, you know, involves, you know, kind of taking the average of their eye position, nose, and all that sort of stuff. And the pictures are taken so they can be merged together like this. So what you're seeing here are not actually faces of specific individuals, but average faces that basically represent the 10 most agreeable individuals that were in the group and the 10 least agreeable faces that were in the group. Most agreeable and least agreeable. Okay, you get the idea. It's very clever. I mean, this is like this, yeah, every once in a while I'll read an experiment and I'll say, geez, I wish I had thought of that. That is so cool. Because it really kind of gets rid of the kind of idiosyncrasies of these faces. And you're not even really showing people individual faces. You're showing them whatever, you know, these 10 people have in common about their personalities. If there's something in their face that can be perceived that tells about that personality trait, then here's that average. Isn't that cool? I think it's really cool, but I'm a big nerd. So that's how these were derived. This is the average of the 10 most conscientious women in that group of 100. This is the average of the 10 least conscientious women. The most extroverted 10 women, the least extroverted 10 women, the most neurotic, the least neurotic, the most open to new experiences, the least. So when we were going through that little, you know, presentation of the faces, when I showed 2 at a time and asked you who is most agreeable, you know, if you found yourself saying, oh, that face on the left is more agreeable than the face on the right, the one that's on the left is more conscientious, then you, in fact, were picking out something about the personality trait of those 10 women who, you know, whose face went into the facial averages. And in fact, okay, it is something that naive subjects can do, okay, to some degree, especially with female faces. It works less systematically with male faces, but with female faces, yeah, it was more likely that people would say that this was the more agreeable, this was the more conscientious, this was the more extroverted, and this was the more neurotic, and this was the more open to new experiences. Not everybody is going to get it perfectly, but overall, you bring in 100 subjects and, you know, at better than chance levels, they're able to say that this is the one that typifies these dimensions, this the most, these are the faces that typify those dimensions the least, which is pretty darn cool if you ask me. Let me just talk about that last dimension, this one having to do with openness to sexual experiences. Again, it was this person on the left versus this person on the right. Okay, this didn't work with male faces either for some reason. I mean, it's an interesting question as why this seems to work better with female faces than male faces. It's unclear. But again, it did work at better than chance levels. This is a separate experiment that was published a couple of years later, and people were able to, based on the exact same methods, right? They were able to make the judgment that this face on the left was, derived from the faces of the 10 women that rated themselves as being more open to casual sex than the people on the faces that came from the people that rated themselves as less likely, the 10 people that rated themselves as less likely. Okay, let's see, there's a question here. People usually find this really interesting. So Canoe. Is Canoe a app or something like that where people judge personalities or something? Is that what this was about? Yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure what Canoe is. Acronym for, oh, see, that's how much I know. Okay, so I'm not a personality psychologist, and so I didn't know Canoe. Now I do. You see how much you taught me? Okay, that's great. Canoe. So I guess it's C-A-N-O-E. Thank you. That's really useful. The Canoe test. All right, that's great. I thought it was an app. Anyway, okay. So this is really interesting because, even if people aren't perfect, and maybe you weren't perfect during the demonstration, look what's going on here. We're talking, first of all, not about elderly faces that might, kind of show their history. These are people in their 20s, early 20s, maybe even younger. And these are faces that are not of individual people. These are faces that are the average of the individuals whose rated personality most typifies or least typifies these dimensions. And, what in the world is this, right? I mean, these are completely neutral faces, right? These are really, really, kind of very homogenized, very clean, very, kind of very basic faces. And still there's something in there. I mean, let's just look at one example. Let's see, which is probably the easiest one. Yeah, there's something, neuroticism. Maybe I'm especially sensitive to neuroticism because of my New York Jewish upbringing. But as you can, I really see this woman as more neurotic than this woman. This woman seems more relaxed to me. And now I know that it is not a single woman. It's the average of 10 women. And I have no idea why this is happening, but it does seem to really kind of flag itself. Now, the scientists, if you're interested, have looked to see what it is in the faces that might allow that. But, in terms of the, what's caused these faces to look one way or another, it could be things that we've discussed. It could be the self-fulfilling prophecy. It could be that, the women whose faces, the 10 women whose faces went up to make this one, in fact, from a very early age, had more neurotic looking faces, whatever that means, and were treated by their parents and their teachers as maybe somebody who would worry, and they would then grow into that personality, where these women had just the opposite. Alternatively, maybe not even alternatively, but another explanation that maybe part of it, along with self-fulfilling prophecy, is that the personality kind of started first, right? And they worried more. These 10 women worried more than these 10 women. And these 10 women then, kind of, their faces changed, even over the course of 20 years or whatever, their faces changed enough for that facial structure to be a little bit different when a picture was taken of them. So their expressive habits, if you worry more, maybe you frown more, and somehow that's in there, even though they're posing neutrally and everything is taken out. They're really very clean, smooth faces. There's no wrinkle lines there or anything like that. There's enough structural change in the face based on a lot of kind of facial expression of worrying that was something that was visible to subjects. Who knows? Who knows? And then another question completely is, what is it then? If it's not, you can't see worry lines, is there something, in the way the mouth shape is? Is there something in the way the eye shape is, the brow or something? I mean, the researchers, don't know. This is an ongoing, question that's continuing to be tested. You find it very interesting. Okay, so the truth is, to some degree, even though we're told not to judge a person's personality based on their appearance, seems that when it comes to faces, we can do it. Well, we do it automatically, probably do it reflexively, and even if we're wrong, we seem to be not completely wrong. We seem to be able to tell something about a person's personality, at least a little bit. There's always going to be exceptions. I don't want to, say that we should judge people based on their face, but we seem to be able to do some of it. And it's interesting that there's facial information that provides that, and our brain is sensitive to it. It's really interesting. Before we leave this discussion, there's something else I wanted to mention about self-fulfilling prophecies and expressive habits that's relevant to something you may have noticed before, where spouses tend to sometimes look like each other, right? You can go on, there's websites for everything. There is a website of pictures of spouses who look very much like each other. And there's lots of reasons that might be the case. I mean, you can think about your parents. Do your parents look like each other? Do their faces look like each other? You're so used to seeing your parents and their differences and that sort of thing. It might not be, but maybe you can think of couples in your extended family, or married couples in your friends' parents, or something like that. I think we can all think about people who kind of look like each other in married couples. And that's not just true of heterosexual couples, by the way. It's true of same-sex couples as well, which is interesting. Okay, there's lots of reasons that might occur, though, right? So there could be, people, might tend to marry within their ethnicity, or their culture, or in their climate, certainly, and that can have a bearing on how people's faces change over time. They eat the same food, potentially, but what's interesting is there are certainly instances of spousal couples converging after they're married. In other words, looking maybe a little alike when they're married, but across, say, 20, 30 years, 40 years, looking more and more like each other as time goes on, which is interesting. Right, so that's what I'm saying. That spouses can converge in facial appearance over time. Some do, some don't. And the way they test this, you can kind of measure things on their face, but very often it just has, these experiments involve having, naive judges, like intro psychology students, judging how much the people in the couple look like each other, or maybe trying to match things, something like that. Match the faces that are in the couples, that sort of thing. So this happens. It absolutely happens. The question is why? And although it's not completely clear why this happens, there is something that the research can tell us that is relevant to what we've been talking about. And we know that the degree to which spouses converge in appearance is related to something about how the spouses interact, how the individuals in the couple interact. So when you do an experiment, you're taking pictures of these spouses, and then you ask something anonymously about the health of their relationship, whether they're empathetic to each other. And what you find is that the spouses that converge more in appearance tend to rate their relationship as more empathetic, meaning that they listen to each other's problems, they help each other with their problems, they feel, for each other's problems. and you know that there are marriages that are more like that and less like that. And, that it can be, I imagine there can be healthy marriages that have less empathy, but I think most folks think that empathy is an important aspect of a healthy marriage. So, say you're taking pictures of couples that have been married for 40 years or something like that. And then you look to see how much they look alike. You can predict how much they will look alike. Oh, you also take pictures of them on their wedding. You get pictures from them on the wedding day. And so in other words, you have judgments of whether they've converged in appearance or whether they've pretty much stayed the same. And the ones that seem to converge in appearance more over those 40 years are ones that consider their relationship more empathetic, which might have to do with expressive habits, right? Because if there's a lot of empathy and people are sharing emotions and sharing their experiences, the expressions are going to be between the spouses are going to be pretty correlated, right? If there's a very, a lot of stressful situations, then, or one person's going through a lot of stress through their life and the other person is going through less, the fact that that second person is going to empathize with the first person and show facial expressions that are empathizing might kind of shape their face to look more like their spouse. So expressive habits might play a role in this phenomenon we know where empathetic couples grow to look more like each other over time. Okay, which is pretty darn cool. Okay, well, I was, going through the literature on that when I was writing the book, and I said, okay, well, I've got to now, of course, look at the most obvious question about faces looking like each other. And that, of course, comes from doggies. I love this picture. This is just an advertisement for dog food or something like that, it looks like. Yeah. But, it's obviously exaggerated, but, it's something that I think most people have thought of before, like, wow, sometimes people really do look like their dogs, right? And is there research to support that? And at least when I was writing the book, and I've looked at it about probably about 6-7 years ago now, there actually wasn't research. What people can do, this is just in a little aside, is, it's not critical that you know the details of this. People can look at pictures of owners and their dogs and match them at better than chance levels. Okay. But you can imagine, I know the sort of person that's likely to have a small dog, or I know the sort of person that's likely to have a big dog, a pit bull, or a Rottweiler or something like that. There's things you can guess about personality and preferences in dogs, and sometimes those personality traits are evident in clothing and things like that. So naive subjects can, at better than chance levels, match a doggy to their owner. However, when it comes to trying to match them on facial appearance, which doggy looks most like which face, there'll be no evidence that facial similarity between dogs and faces is something that's based on ownership, right? Anybody's face can be matched to a doggy image, right? But that doesn't mean that that person owns that dog, right? And so, in other words, we don't grow to look like our dogs more over time. We don't choose dogs that look like us. Maybe some people do, I know, but for the most part, that's not the case. So unfortunately, I was really hoping to find that people love their dogs. Maybe they grow to look a little bit more like their dogs over time. So far, there's no evidence for that. Okay. All right. This might not be a bad place to take a quick little break before we finish our discussion on faces and do a practice question. So let's do that. Oh, what did I do? Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'll stop sharing. Here I am. All right, so let's do our first practice question of the day. And this one is about the uncanny valley, and it should be very simple for you. The uncanny valley phenomenon is A, most likely to occur with human forms, B, most likely to occur with faces, C, might be related to our natural tendency to avoid corpses, or D, all of the above. Okay, I'll give you about a minute to answer this. Should be easy. You can look back on your notes or on the slide. The answer should be right there. All right, another 10 seconds or so, and we'll go over our answer. All right, that's fine. Well, most of you got it right. It is all of the above. And let me explain why. Now that I've read this, I can see how people might get a little bit confused, but okay. So it is the case that it is most likely to occur with human forms. We did talk quickly about this in the sense that we talked about there can be movements that people pick up on, not just in faces, but also in the body. The movements of the limbs have to be correct, but human forms can also include faces, and so that's important. And human here is to distinguish it from, you know, the animations, say, of King Kong, or animations of dogs and things like that that have been shown in movies. Most of those, most people find those pretty compelling and don't kind of really have the uncanny situation with that. Of course, we know it's most likely to occur with faces. That's the whole point of using the uncanny valley phenomenon to get us into the face perception research. And do remember that C is also correct. It might be related to our natural tendencies to avoid corpses. So, you know, it's one thing to talk about the phenomenon as evidence that we're really, really sensitive to faces, human faces. But another thing to have an explanation as to why do we have a reaction of eeriness or kind of disgust, or ew, that thing looks creepy. And it's thought that that might be based on our sensitivity to things that look human, but not quite, that look like they are, you know, kind of, you know, not quite alive and human. And that we know that we do have a natural, you know, we find corpses repelling. You know, there's good reason for that. We don't want to catch disease and that sort of thing. That's evolutionarily advantageous. And possibly the reaction we have with the uncanny valley is because, you know, if it looks like a human, but not quite alive in a human way, okay, we get that kind of eerie reaction to it. So that is also true, which makes D the correct answer, all of the above. Of course, now you'll know that when you see it on the exam. Okay, cool. Any questions on this before we continue, or any comments on any of the face stuff? All right, then let's continue. And you'll see I did skip a slide. I think there there was a slide on face perception development that I'm skipping, but it's all covered in the book. So make sure you read the book on that. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about an issue that is kind of about the brain. And it is this. If we have, you know, something in our brain that makes us especially sensitive to faces, are there processes that that the brain applies just to face images that it doesn't apply to non-face images? Right? Is it that the brain detects a face or something like a face, and then goes through a type of analysis that makes it especially efficient, that it really does reserve for face perception. And that's what I mean here by, does the brain use processes when it's looking at a face that are specific to faces? That's what I mean here by face-specific processing. And it's something that scientists have asked for a very long time, at least 50 years, because we seem so efficient when it comes to processing faces. You know, we get all this information that we've discussed when it comes to looking at faces. Do we use special processes? And one of the ways that has been, one of the demonstrations that has been used to suggest that maybe there is something special about face processing is a phenomenon that's called the facial inversion effect. And hopefully, you probably knew who that was after you, I hope you know who Hillary Clinton is, right? You're old enough, certainly, to know who Hillary Clinton is. You might not have known when you were seeing her upside down. She's a much younger picture here. But when she's upright, when you see her face upright, you have no problem recognizing her. And it's almost as if it jumps out at us. We seem to be especially good at recognizing upright faces. So everything I've talked about in face perception so far, including things like the uncanny valley to some degree, seems really to be specific to upright faces. We seem, again, disproportionately better at perceiving upright faces than inverted faces. In fact, when you invert a face, it becomes much, much harder to recognize. It can become harder to make judgments about the person's age and certainly personality things and stuff like that. Our sensitivity to faces really seems to be upright faces, so that when you invert a face, you lose a lot of information. That's the idea, that inverting a face disproportionately hinders our ability to recognize it. Right? This isn't true of other images, other classes of images, say looking at pictures of doggies or looking at pictures of houses when it comes to recognizing, you know, learning a series of houses and then looking at pictures of those houses. That inverting of the house image isn't going to have the same inhibiting effect. It's not going to have the same kind of it's not going to cause the same sort of trouble for our recognition, where inverting faces really, really, really affects it. And there's lots of demonstrations of this that I'll talk about in just a second. But why would that be the case? And might that give us some insight to what type of face-specific processes the brain might use to be so efficient at perceiving faces? Well, here's one idea. That when we look at faces, when we look at Hillary Clinton's face, we look at certainly the mouth, the eyes, the shape of the face to do a recognition. But we also look at something else. We look at the configuration of how high the eyes are above the nose, how high the nose is above the mouth, and how high the mouth is above the chin, and how low everything is relative to, say, the top of the head or the hairline or something like that. In other words, when we look at her, we are using information not just about her facial features, but about the configuration of those features. And so one idea is that when we look at faces, we use two types of analysis. The brain is doing two types of analysis to recognize that face and recognize, you know, aspects of that person's personality potentially, and mood and age and you know, the genetic health and all that sort of stuff that comes out in it. We are looking at individual features, you know, the eyes, the color of the eyes, the size of the nose, but also how those features are configured on the face, how high the eyes are relative to the mouth, that sort of thing. And in fact, when we invert a face, we lose that configural information, right? We no longer have the eyes a certain distance above the nose, which our brain has taken a note of when it came to recognizing Hillary's face. or that the mouth is a certain distance above the chin. We lose that information when a face is inverted. Let's put back upright. Hooray, we can use that information again. And that configural analysis, the analysis of configural information, may be what makes our face processing so efficient. Okay. So efficiency of face recognition, we can just talk about this in terms of recognizing Hillary or recognizing other famous people, might be based on the fact that we do an extra analysis when it comes to faces. We not only look at faces feature by feature, we look at those features relative to other features. And that allows us to be so efficient at recognizing faces. We don't do that sort of configural analysis when we're looking at houses or dogs or cars or other classes of visual stimuli. But when we're looking at faces, we do. And one way of showing that is by inverting the face so you no longer are able to do it, right? And that at that point, you just need to use the features like you're doing an analysis of, dog pictures or house pictures or something like that. And that's why it disproportionately inhibits what is usually an astonishingly efficient process. Upright faces are perceived, recognized, especially quickly. And that might be because we do these two types of analyses, the second of which, configural, is reserved for upright faces. Okay. So that's the idea. That's specific to faces, and it doesn't work with doggy pictures and that sort of thing. And inversion, when you would invert the image, when you turn over Hillary's head or my face or whatever, you're no longer able to use that configural analysis, and therefore not able to use these face-specific sorts of processes that your brain does. Okay, so that's kind of a provocative idea, right? That this inversion effect's kind of fun, right? We seem disproportionately challenged to recognize upside down faces. Meaning that our special talents with faces are really about upright faces, not faces in general, but they need to be upright or nearly upright. Okay, if you invert it, it inhibits it, which really might be an inhibition of the configural analysis that our face processing typically does. Well, one of my favorite examples of this is something called the Margaret Thatcher effect, and I don't know if you know who Margaret. She's been in the popular press more recently because I don't know if you watched the TV series The Crown, but she was portrayed by, what was her name, Gillian Anderson in The Crown, and there was a movie with Meryl Streep where she portrayed Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of England in the 80s, very conservative, called the Iron Lady sometimes. This effect, her legacy though, she's an important political figure in British history, but her legacy in perceptual psychology is a little different because some psychologists in the 80s used her face to do this really kind of unique demonstration. There she is right there. She's upside down as you can see. And there's two separate images of her. And you can see those images are very, very similar. Maybe there's if you look at it carefully, you can see a little bit that has changed between the images, but you have to look at it a little bit more carefully. However, when you reinvert and show Margaret Thatcher upright along with the somewhat modified picture, look how striking the difference is, right? And as you can see, as soon as things are made upright, it jumps out at us. It's scary. That one on the left there, this one here is a scary Margaret Thatcher. And the reason it's thought that this is so much more conspicuous than when she's completely inverted is that we are especially sensitive to upright faces. Okay, it's just another example of this where, potentially it's the configural processing that allows us then to look, and see these distortions that are occurring in the future. Clearly, what they did there is they took out the mouth and turned it upside down, took out the eyes and turned it upside down. There's a lot of other ways you can show this. Like what you could do with Margaret Thatcher is both could have upright eyes and mouth, and you could just extend her hairline so it goes up a little bit, which you would not notice in the inverted images. But once it was turned upright, you would notice it right away. So that sensitivity we've been talking about all through our discussion of faces is really about upright faces, possibly facilitated by the configural sort of processing that the brain does. Before I leave here, though, before I leave this discussion of faces, I do want to be completely honest about the face research. That more recently, within the last 10, 15 years, we've begun to kind of look at whether faces are the only things that truly go through this configural processing. So, doggies are a great example. If you have average experience with dogs, I mean, if you own a dog, if you've owned a number of dogs, that's fine. You probably would not show any sort of configural processing of a dog image. However, if you're a dog breeder, and maybe some of you are, there's a lot of dog breeders in Southern California. Maybe you come from families or have extended family that's done some dog breeding. Dog breeders have a very sort of different perceptual relationship with their dogs. So say I'm a Cocker Spaniel breeder, and I've got a family of Cocker Spaniels living in the back, and I breed them to be show dogs, and I sell them for lots of dough, whatever. I get to know Cocker Spaniel, especially these Cocker Spaniels really, really, really well. And I know their family. I know that this one looks like this one looks more like this one because there's a family resemblance and all that sort of thing. After a while, after having spent so much time with these Cocker Spaniels, would start to be able to do that configural processing with images of Cocker Spaniels, especially my Cocker Spaniels, but it also generalizes to other similar Cocker Spaniels. Okay, in other words, that my experience, especially kind of the complicated experience that one needs to be able to distinguish dogs that have family relationships, that dogs look like their parents and all that sort of thing, just like people do. By being able to pick that sort of stuff out and make fine discriminations between all these doggies, my brain starts to do the same type of processing that everybody does with faces. Okay, not only true of dogs, people. Hopefully you're getting the idea that people who breed dogs, okay, especially of a specific breed, will show face-like processing with dog images. This isn't just true of people who breed dogs. This is also true of people who design cars, especially spend time looking at the front of cars, right? And have to be able to quickly recognize cars and the year of the car, the model of the car from looking at the front of cars. So the designer of the Prius, and the Prius has changed over time, and knowing that this front of the Prius is from the initial run of the Prius. This one is from the second run. This is from the more modern Prius, and be able to do that quickly and know how the changes occurred, right? They also start to show these kind of specialized configural processes, and the parts of their brains that are often thought to be involved. And we talked about this before when we talked about prosopagnosia. The parts of their brains that are usually considered to be relevant to face perception also seem to get involved now with car perception, if they are in fact car designers, car experts. Same with the doggy breeders. Their part of the brain that is reserved for faces also start showing activity when they look at their dog breed that they know so well. So are these configural processes specific to face perception? For a lot of us, yeah, probably, unless we have a very detailed and complex kind of experience with another class of visual stimuli. So it really might not necessarily be specific to faces, but specific to expertise with a class of visual stimuli. Most of us aren't going to show configural processing with doggy images or the front, pictures of the fronts of cars or something like that. but people that, have a lot of experience and know the relationships between the images. This one's from this Prius is, from the 90s, this Prius is from the early 2000s, all that sort of stuff. They start to show those sort of configurable processes. So these sorts of specialized processes are true for all of us with faces. We are face experts in that sense, but they also could be maybe used in other instances of expertise. So these specific processes might be specific to expertise with a class of visual stimuli. Okay, a couple of quick comments here. Why don't we invert the nose, giving too much away? Hey, do we pick the eyes and mouth to flip? Is there any active choice? So, I see what you're saying. So for the Margaret Thatcher effect, how do we pick the eyes? Yeah, so the Margaret Thatcher effect does work well with the eyes and mouth, but it also will work with the nose. I don't know if it works as well with the nose. It's a very good question, but I know it works. You can extend, the length of the head. You can extend the length of the chin, and not notice it when it's inverted. Really, I think the Margaret Thatcher effect, Ivy, is most useful for really exemplifying how we are so sensitive to upright versus inverted faces. I mean, you can do major distortions on a face. This is a major distortion, and not really detect it with an inverted face versus an upright face. Okay, and it's thought that there's something about the configurable processing that allows us to be more sensitive to these distortions. It's a good question. Okay, great. Okay, and if there's no other questions about faces, we're going to shift gears here and go to another topic, I believe. Yes, let's do that. Oh, Ivy, you know that the Margaret Thatcher effect? Yeah. No, I've been a real fan of it too. I actually have a wonderful example in my office, and we actually use the effect. Maybe I'll pull out these stimuli in lip reading examples, which we might have time to talk about later. Yes, I'm a big fan too. Thank you. Okay, so now we just did a question. So let me go ahead and put up the new slides here. Take a second. Yeah. Okay. We can share the screen. I think we're good to go. So we are moving our topic now from that first chapter on visual perception and talking about, the second chapter on visual perception, which I discuss as one emphasizing imitation. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting kind of phenomena that has kind of emerged over the last one of the most interesting phenomena that has emerged over the last 10, 15 years. Let me just get my own slides, my own notes out here. Just take us another second here. Nobody panic. Oh boy, yeah, here it is. Okay. So, we've known a little bit about imitation, and maybe you've experienced this sort of thing where you've been talking to somebody at a party, over lunch, and you've noticed yourself imitating somebody else. Somebody's standing like this at a party, and you might notice yourself standing like this after a little while. Someone's, maybe crossing their legs, sitting down, and you end up crossing your legs. And you're kind of aware of this every once in a while. I think this is actually one thing that we're studying currently in my lab, and hopefully I'll have a chance to talk about it later. But the example I often give is when you're talking to somebody who has a foreign accent and you've been talking to them for a while, you might notice yourself just briefly, taking on a little of that accent. You might say a word that they've said recently and might say it with their accent. And I know when I do that, I'm I'm embarrassed. I'm really embarrassed. Like, oh my gosh, I hope they don't feel like I'm mocking them, right? And in the lab, I'll tell you about this later, but in the lab, we're studying whether or not that person with the accent who you've just subtly imitated actually is aware that you imitated them. And I think the answer might be no, but we can talk about that a little bit later. Anyway, this is just something we've known. And we've just talked about this a little bit in the context of faces, that we certainly do, share expressions, and not just subtly. Sometimes, when it's polite to smile back when somebody smiles at you, right? We're very aware of that. So you guys seeing everything okay here? There's something going on a little bit strange with this slide. Okay, it looks all right. Just hold on a second. All right, you let me know if you can't see the slide or something like that. It seems okay. Anyway, the story is we inadvertently imitate postures, speech, facial expressions. This is something that we've known for a long time. But what we've just come to know within the last 10, 15 years or so is how much imitation actually goes on and what the benefits of the imitation actually are. That it's not something that's random. It's not something that just happens kind of by accident. On some level, it's happening all the time. Your brain is always doing imitation of other people in a very interesting way, and it provides some very fundamental benefits. Okay, some very fundamental benefits. Okay, so let's talk about this. For a long time, the early research would look at body language sorts of things. So one of the earlier experiments looked to see how when students went in during office hours, they would sometimes imitate their professor's body language, right? And that makes some sense. And it goes the other way too. The professors will imitate the students' body language. But the question is, did it have any sort of ramification? And it's unclear what's the cause and effect here, but what you found is that the students that did more kind of accidental imitation of their professors rated that interaction, as did the professors, also rated that interaction as having better rapport. Okay, so again, we're talking about imitation here, by the way. I should have maybe made this a little bit clear. We're not talking about explicit imitation like the folks on Saturday Night Live do of politicians and famous people, where they're impersonators, whatever. Or like you did when you were a kid. You probably have a sibling. You probably imitated them. They probably imitated you just to bug them, right? My boy certainly did this. It's awful. But we're not talking about that either. We are talking about accidental imitation, kind of unconscious imitation. And that's what we're talking about with the students and the professors, that when the students went in there, they were, secretly filmed. And when they came out, they were told, hey, you were filmed. Is it okay if we use your thing? And they said, oh, sure. Were you aware that you, kind of took on some of the body language and some of the postures of the professor? I said, no, I wasn't aware of that at all. I was just kind of concentrating on what we were talking about. But they're able to then measure that based on the videotapes they get. And they say, okay, well, how did you find the rapport? Did you find it a successful meeting? And the amount of this unconscious imitation that went on predicted better rapport. The more the students imitated the professor, the better the interaction was then rated by the student and by the professor, without knowing that the imitation was going on. So again, this is all happening. This imitation is more or less happening at an unconscious level. Okay, but the more imitation, the better rapport, as long as it's unconscious. Okay, jump up another like 20 years to look at other examples of this that were kind of more systematically studied, not just kind of these casual observations, by putting video cameras in offices and asking this sort of thing, but actually now manipulating this sort of thing a little bit. This is how it works. By the way, these are called the chameleon effects for the most part, generally chameleon effects, because how chameleons change color depending on their surroundings. The idea is that in body language, even in facial expressions and speech and that sort of stuff, we kind of become chameleons and kind of change just a tiny bit based on our surroundings. If we're talking to somebody who's speaking fast, we speak a little faster. If we're talking to somebody whose legs are crossed, we are more likely to cross our legs. Again, it's not a complete imitation. That would be annoying, right? And it's unconscious, but these are known as chameleon effects. And this now is an example of an experiment that explicitly tested these sort of chameleon effects. This is how it works. Imagine you're outside of a laboratory waiting to come in. Somebody else is there. You chat with them as you're waiting to come in. This is your intro psychology credit requirements. So you have to, both of you have to do some experiments. You finally let into the lab. You sit down, and you have a very simple sort of task. You are asked to look at some pictures and describe the picture to the other person well enough so they could then draw it later on. Okay, so that's what you're seeing here. This, by the way, is a famous actor going through a demonstration for TV, Alan Alda. I don't know if you know that. That's okay, it doesn't make a difference. This was a science show they were doing it for, but he's kind of showing what the task is like. And so, you as an intro psychology student in this experiment would say, okay, I see it's a city scene, and there's a car there, and there's I don't know, it looks like there's a number of light posts, and there's one on the left of the car, and that sort of thing. It goes back and forth, and the other person takes their turn. Now here's the trick of it. Even though the other person who came in with you looked like your age, okay, and probably had taken intro psychology at one point, they're really not a naive subject like you. They're really what we call a confederate of the research. They're part of the research design. They know what the experiment's about, and they're basically, kind of part of what the manipulation is going to be. So they pretend they're just like you, they're just a naive subject. But what they're going to do is they're going to start a couple of movements, very casually, like maybe as they're reading, okay, I see a mountain scene, and I see there's an airplane going over the mountain. Look what I'm doing here, I'm rubbing my face, right? And I see there's a lake at the bottom of it with a boat, sailboat. And I'm rubbing my face as I'm doing that. The question is now, when it goes back to the other person to, look through their next picture and describe their next picture, is that person going to imitate that face rubbing thing that you just did? Okay, that's the question. So, and they did it not just face rubbing, they did a couple other things too. They did a foot shaking thing, like where they crossed their legs and they were kind of just gently shaking their foot like this. Very subtly, very inconspicuously, so it wasn't clear that they were trying to get the other person to do it. Would in fact those sorts of subtle body language sorts of motions induce the naive person to imitate it? And what they found is, yeah, absolutely. The other person, the naive person, would in fact imitate some of those movements, some of those kind of body language sort of things, and would do so unconsciously, right? So after the experiment's over and a video is taken, and they're told that they're being videotaped through the whole thing, that they don't know, the naive subject doesn't know they're being videotaped to see if they're imitating the confederate. That subject is then saying, great, thank you so much. Did you find the task easy? Yeah, no, it was really easy. Did you have any questions? No. Did you know that you were imitating some of the body language that the other person had? Like at one point they were rubbing your face, and right after you were rubbing your face. No, I didn't know I was rubbing my face. I guess I could have been, but I wasn't aware of that. I was concentrating on the pictures like you told me to. Okay, so you weren't aware that you imitated them? No. Later on, they kind of shook their foot a little bit, and then, hey, you did that too when it was your turn to read the picture. Did you notice that? Not at all. I was just concentrating on the task. They were completely unconscious of their imitation. Now, don't get me wrong. The imitation, wasn't the imitation wasn't constant, and it wasn't exactly like what the Confederate was doing. It was just, maybe if the Confederate was doing this type of thing, then later on, the subject, as they were reading, might touch their face a little bit more. The Confederates shaking their foot, through much of their, kind of reading the picture, one of the pictures. It's not like the subject, a naive subject, then does it through the entire, kind of describing of their picture. They just do it a tiny bit, but they do it much more than they would have if the if the Confederate had not done it at all. So yes, you can, in fact, induce this sort of imitation, and importantly, it's unconscious on the subject's part. They are completely naive to the fact that they are doing the imitating. Okay, interesting. A couple of other things I can say about this. Kind of follow-up research on this sort of thing showed not only did these kind of naive subjects imitate the kind of body language, the kind of general body language sorts of things that the Confederate is doing, they will do so at with the same speed, which is also interesting. So if in fact, the foot shaking is slow like this, the naive subject will also do a little foot shaking, not that much, but a little foot shaking, and that foot shaking will be slow. If on the other hand, the Confederate was shaking their foot a little faster, then the naive subject would also do that. The same with face rubbing, and I think they then included some other actions, and it was the same sort of thing. It's not only that the actions are imitated, but the speed of the action. So there's, again, all unconsciously, very important to emphasize that. The information that they're then going to use to unconsciously control their body also takes in this other dimension of the speed. And then there's lots of other examples of this beyond this type of method. You can ask somebody to sit down and watch a video of somebody running on a treadmill. So the person's not even in the same room actually as the person running. It's just a video that was taken, a nice, very clear kind of close-up video. Well, close-up, I guess, is so that you can see the person running. As often some of us do on the treadmill, you start off kind of running slowly, and then, it's the treadmill's programmed to speed up, a little bit at a time until maybe you're at your best, aerobic zone. So it's kind of going fast now. What you see is in the subject who's watching, and I can't remember what their task actually is. It's a distracting task, so they're not aware of the actual purpose of the experiment. I don't know if they're asked to count the footsteps. Probably that's probably a little much. It could be to push a button whenever the treadmill speeds up or something. Let's make it very easy. Just push a button whenever you see the treadmill speeding up, and so that's very intuitive. But they're also having, their breathing monitored. And what you find is that their breathing does increase a little bit as the subject's inferring the breathing of the person on the treadmill. So clearly, as you're going slower, you're not breathing, the person on the treadmill is not breathing too hard. But then when it speeds up, they're starting to breathe very hard. And you can see that, the subject can see that. Their own breathing also increases a little bit, which is interesting. It's not, you're not like out of breath, certainly, but your breathing speeds up just a little bit in coordination with what you assume the breathing of the exerciser is. Again, all unconsciously. That's very, very important to point out. It's all unconscious. You ask the subjects afterwards, did you find the task hard? Nope, I just pushed the button whenever I saw them speeding up or then slowing down or whatever. Okay, did you know you were kind of speeding up your breathing a little bit when you were watching them and they speeded up, the exerciser speeded up your breathing? No, I did not. I was breathing normally. But in fact, a little bit changes. Again, all inadvertent. None of it's on purpose and all unconscious, right? Which is really interesting. Next, and this turns out to have a very interesting clinical implication. It has to do with eating amounts. That people will often eat the amount of food that the people they are eating with eat. So if you go out to dinner with folks that like to finish all the food on their plate, you are more likely to eat more. If you go out to dinner with folks that kind of just, pick a little bit and maybe, don't eat too much of their plate on their plate, then you're less likely to eat that much. It's a shift. Now, it's not like you're going to eat exactly how much somebody else eats. So, you're going to eat within a range that's comfortable for you. But within that range, you will be influenced by the eating behavior of the other people at the table with you. Okay. That turns out to have this interesting clinical implication. In fact, my wife is a real psychologist, and she specializes in patients with eating disorders. And this is a very well-known phenomenon. In fact, for people who are in intensive programs, have serious eating disorders and have to be in homes for a while, they're inpatients. They have to be very careful about who's eating with who, because they know that this imitation does happen, and it's typically unconscious. For an eating disorder patient, it might be a little bit more conscious, but they have to make sure that that these patients are not eating less because of being in a situation where there's a lot of people who are kind of going to tend to eat less if they have anorexia or something like that. So this is very well known. For most of us, it is, though, very unconscious. You're not, if you're asked at the end, did you realize you ate more with these people than you ate with these people? And almost everyone says, no, I didn't know. I know I ate a lot, but I didn't realize there was an influence by the eating behavior of the other folks I was eating with. Okay. One other thing I wanted to say that's on the slide, and that has to do with something that relates a little bit to the uncanny valley. That these imitations, these kind of subtle influences where we are unconsciously imitating each other, has to be initiated by watching or interacting with somebody who is human. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, say you're in the experiment where you're kind of keeping tabs on the changing speed of the treadmill. In order for that breathing to change, in order for your breathing to subtly change, you need to be watching a person, not a simulation, not an avatar. It has to be a person. You can't have an animation, especially an animation that looks very animated, for this to occur. Even if it's a great animation, if there's an uncanny valley sort of experience to this character, you will not do the imitation. The imitation seems to only be induced, or for the most part seems to be induced, by having a human, a kind of certified, truly perceived human performing these different behaviors. Okay, so it's interesting whether it's an interesting question whether imitation is somehow related to our sensitivity to human forms in one way or another. Does it only get kicked in when we are only dealing with what the brain is absolutely convinced is a human form? It's an interesting question. Okay, let's end our first half there, take our little 10-minute break, and come back at about 11:43. All right, we are back. Huh. Okay, let's do a question. Let's do a practice question. Does that sound fun? Sure, that sounds fun, Professor Rosenblum. All right, here we go. This is another face one. And this one is about smiling faces. So this question is, when you see a smiling face, A, your emotions could be very slightly changed. B, you very subtly imitate that face with your own. C, your smile-related muscles are activated. Or D, all of the above. That's an easy one. I'll give you a minute to go ahead and finish this one. All right, about another 10 seconds. All right. Perfect. You all got it right. Easy one. So yes, when you see a smiling face, your emotions are potentially changed a tiny bit. You know, I don't want you to go out and spend money on these programs that you can get where you just see a lot of smiling faces to try to cheer you up. It's a very temporary change. It's a very subtle change. But you do find a little bit of an elevation in mood by looking, even though it's very, very temporary. It does seem to be related to some degree to the imitation that you're doing when you're looking at the face, because you do that as the answer B suggests. You very subtly imitate that face with your own. Again, it can be very, very subtle, though, to the point where it can only be really measured with that muscle activity that's listed in C. Your muscle-related, your smile-related muscles are activated. So all of those things are true. The correct answer is D. All right. That will be on your exam. Cool. All right. Any questions before we continue our discussion of imitation? And let's go ahead and share our screen here. Okay. So we're going to discuss now a little bit about the development of our imitative behaviors. Because in fact, we know that as soon as you were born, you were imitating. So you've been imitating your whole life. And we know that as early as it can be studied, we do see imitation in very young infants. Now, this is, as you can imagine, a pretty tricky thing to imitate. You know, this first image you're going to see is here. Where is it? There it is. That is not a 2-week-old infant by any means. So this is an infant that's actually looks like maybe intentionally imitating to some degree. What we are talking about here are very young infants that are 2 weeks old. It's of course hard to say what's intentional with a 2-week-old infant, but you see them do things like imitating tongue protrusions and blinking and some expression-like behavior. Now, let's be very, very clear that is a 2-week-old infant you're seeing there, that they don't have a lot of control, a lot of muscular control over their faces. So it's not like, you know, they're going to see their mommy sticking out their tongue and they're going to be sticking out their tongue right back, like this image shows. This is like probably, I said, at least a 6-month-old infant. But we want to test it earlier to see, is this something that's online at a very early age, possibly at birth? And so what you see is, kind of the infants kind of, moving their head around, that sort of thing. But then they will show something that looks a little like a tongue sticking out, if in fact the mom has done it, and it won't be right away by any means. It might be sometime over the next minute or something like that. But you will see more tongue sticking out behavior than, say, another behavior that she does later on, say closing the mouth or something like that. Then you'll see the infant doing that too. So it's important to realize that, it's not the sort of imitation you're seeing in that upper right image at all. It is something more random. So tongue protrusions you see in these infants, blinking, and some expression-like behavior. So, something that looks a little bit like a smile, that sort of thing. But again, it almost looks like it's a random kind of facial expression, but you do see a little bit more if in fact the mom has done it. Okay. What else? Speech movements, and this is my area of research to some degree, not with infants, but with heard speech and seen speech. If in fact an infant sees an image of a face of someone producing an ah, or sees the image of a face of someone producing an the infant will show facial postures that are like that over the next minute. Again, you look at the infant, it almost seems like they're moving around their face randomly. It's 2 weeks old. They don't have a lot of control, but they will show a little bit more ah-like behavior if someone was in front of them posing that face, and a little bit more like behavior if there was somebody in front of them posing that face instead. And interestingly, it's not only true of the little infant seeing an image of a face, maybe their mom or somebody else posing those things. If the infant is looking away, or somebody's behind them, so the infant can't see their face and only hear these sounds like ah or okay, they can't see what the face is doing, but they can hear the person making these speech sounds. The infant will, in fact, make the same sort of facial expressions as if they had seen it. Okay, they can't make these sounds yet, really, at all. It's 2 weeks old, right? But if they hear somebody behind them produce an ah sound, or somebody on a recording produce an ah sound, they will hold their mouth open a little bit more over the next minute than if they hear an sound, in which case they'll close their lips a little bit more over the next minute. Again, you watch these kids and it kind of looks like they're drunk. They're kind of moving their face randomly, but you will see more ah types of movements if they just heard an ah, and more types of movements if they just heard an m. So that type of imitation seems like it's online pretty early. I mean, this is something that the brain really seems ready to do. And actually to the point where it can control the muscles of the face of the infant at 2 weeks old, which is really, really, really young. Okay. Then when you're an adult, or as you're kind of even as a child learning a language, or then kind of establishing a language, we know that individuals during a conversation will imitate each other's words. So in other words, there's multiple words for each idea, but they will kind of share words when two people are talking with each other, right? They'll use the same syntax, and what that means is the word ordering. So you can say the dog bit the cat, or the cat was bit by the dog. One's active voice and passive voice is not important. You know the difference. Both convey the same idea, but if one of the people speaking is using active voice more often, so the dog bit the cat, the other person will use active voice more often too. Versus if the person's using the cat was bit by the dog, the other person will use that passive voice as well. The cat was bit by the dog. Again, these things are all unconscious. These are all unconscious sorts of things. What else? Rate, meaning, and this has been studied a great deal, that individuals will kind of move towards each other's speaking rate. Now, I come from the Northeast, where people talk faster than they say they do in the South, or maybe even in Southern California. And so if you were to talk to me, You know, if we were to meet in person and talk, or even probably over Zoom, you might talk a little bit faster if you're from you know, a slower speaking part of the country, Texas, say, or something. And I might slow down my speech a little bit. Now, we're not going to match perfectly, right? I'm always going to talk a little faster than you if you're from Texas. I'm just using Texas as an example of slow speech. I don't know if it's actually an example, a region where they speak slower, but South often is. We're not going to match perfectly, but here I am, Northeast speaking rate. Here you are, Texas speaking rate. We will move a little bit towards each other. Okay. Intonation is how much pitch change occurs when I'm talking, right? So I could have a monotone voice like this a little bit, and you know, that's not very much of a pitch change. Or I could really kind of, you know, raise my voice sometimes and lower it sometimes to make a point. You know, sometimes I go like this to make a point. And if you were talking with me, if I had a large pitch range, you might increase your pitch range a little too. But if you typically had less of a pitch range, you know, you had a little bit more of a, you know, not a monotone necessarily, but you didn't raise your pitch as high or lower it as much as me, I would probably constrain my pitch range a little bit. So people kind of move towards each other in terms of the intonation of their speech. And accent, finally, as we were talking about before. And that's something, as I said, my lab's been very, very interested in. Now, we do know that even in instances where people aren't aware of imitating somebody else's accent, they do change their speech a little bit to do so, right? It might not be conspicuous either to the person who's doing the imitating or the person who's been imitated, but there are measurable changes. You know, you basically make the recordings and you bring them to the laboratory, and you can record and say, yeah, when this native English speaker was speaking to this person with, you know, a Spanish, Mexican accent of some type, regional accent of some type, yeah, this native English speaker did change their manner of speaking a tiny bit. It's not really noticeable by ear, but we can measure it. So it's clear that they are in fact doing this. All of these instances are unconscious, though. They are accidental. They're not, you know, they're not intentional, and they are not something a person is typically conscious of. So it's like, you know, in all these experiments we'll be talking about, at the end, subjects are always asked, were you aware that you were speaking a little faster when you talked to this person? Were you aware that your intonation was a little less than it usually is? So people are recorded after and during the or before and during the conversation, that sort of thing. You know, all those sorts of things are asked in these experiments, and it's all unconscious and you know, inadvertent. It's not done on purpose. One of the reasons I got really interested in this in my own lab is because of the precision with which the imitation can sometimes happen. And so basically we're going from things like, you know, sentence structure to words. All these things are imitated. Down to the melody of the sentence, down to the rate. And now we're talking about the little kind of consonants and vowels that we produce when we're producing language. Those things get imitated too. So the fine-grained aspects of speech get imitated. You'll see that even within a consonant, we're talking about things being imitated. So here's a great example. I'm going to teach you one of the features that distinguish two consonants from each other. The difference would be pa and ba, pa and ba. So imagine, we'll just put it in a vowel so it's easier to hear. Pa versus ba, pa versus ba. And you know, hopefully you're able to hear that clearly, that I'm making a pa as in pot and a ba is in bottle, right? The difference between those two consonants, the pa and ba, is pretty subtle. I mean, if you look on my mouth, it looks like I'm doing the same thing, right? Right, that sort of thing. But you can notice the difference, not only from what you're hearing, but also you can feel the difference if you do this. If you go like this, pa, ba, and exaggerate a little bit, pa, ba, okay? When you make that pa sound, you can feel a little puff of air. Okay. Pa, ba, pa, ba. What's causing that puff of air is the fact that when you release your lips for pa, your vocal cords aren't vibrating yet. They're actually, the vocal cords are kind of, positioned apart. And so air can easily just rush right through it, which is why you feel that air coming, out your mouth when you do pa, pa, okay? For ba, on the other hand, okay, your vocal cords are vibrating as soon as you release your lips, maybe even a little before. I'm going to exaggerate. Ba, ba. You can actually hear me kind of humming in the beginning. Ba. Okay. And so the vocal cords are kind of catching the air. And that's why you don't feel that puff of air when you go ba, but you do feel the puff of air. Your vocal cords are opened, not vibrating at the beginning of pa, pa. So what we're looking at here is the kind of relationship between when your lips open and when your vocal cords start vibrating, okay, for pa and ba. And that has a name in the speech world. It's called voice onset time. You should know the term. I'll probably use it on a test, but you don't need to know the technical details. Voice onset time. And basically it's just saying that the vocal cords, okay, vibrate at a different time relative to the lips when you're producing pa versus ba. And this is, just my image here. This is very clear. Let's look at these down here. Okay, so basically this is just a little graph showing what's going on with the lips. The lips are closed, and right here they open for the pa ba articulation. Cool. Let's just go down here. This is what the vocal cords are doing. They're starting to vibrate just before the lips are parting when we produce a ba. But for pa, look at, there's a little tiny delay here, so that your lips release sooner than, your lips release sooner than the vocal cords start vibrating. That's what this is showing. Here's your lips releasing. There's a tiny little delay before the vocal cords start vibrating. That's what voicing means. There is just the vocal cords are vibrating. Okay, the vocal cords vibrate a little tiny bit before. This is actually exaggerated. A tiny bit before your lips release for ba. The vocal cords are vibrating a tiny bit after you release your lips for pa. Okay. Now, does that make sense? Yeah, and that's true of everybody. But here's what's different between everybody. How much that delay occurs is going to be different depending on where you grew up. So this little delay here I'm talking about. Some people have longer delays, some people have shorter delays, right? So I think in England, for example, in many regions of England, that delay for the pa, where your voice starts vibrating, your vocal cords start vibrating after you release your lips, can be pretty extreme. So, if I'm saying, if I say Posh Spice, right? Your favorite singer, Posh Spice. Right? That's how it's. However, if I were to say that in, with a British accent, I might go Posh Spice, Posh Spice, where I'm really delaying my vocal cords, and that kind of delay, can signal the kind of wealth class and all that sort of stuff. There's a whole bunch of social linguistics that goes into that, but it's not important you know that. What's important is that that people have different amounts of delay, and that's why this little H is put in there, kind of just to hint that this person has a really long delay. In fact, I bet when Posh Spice introduces herself, that's not her real name, I know that, but when she was Posh Spice, when she introduced herself, nice to meet you, I'm Posh Spice. Okay, she said it like this, and I then responded when I met her. This is all fictitious, of course. When I met her, I said, nice to meet you, Posh, right? With a very, very, very little delay. So her delay is longer than my delay. Posh's actual delay is longer than my delay. They're both heard as P. I didn't say Bosh Spice, right? I had a tiny delay there, but her delay is much longer because she comes from a much more aristocratic sort of culture than me, Syracuse, New York. Okay, so the extent of that delay is specific to different speakers. Posh's delay is impressively a lot longer than Rosenblum's delay. Okay, but here's the thing: as Posh and I continue to speak, she starts to shorten her p sounds. Okay, so there's less of a delay. I starting to lengthen my posh sound, so I start to sound a little bit more like her. So this imitation, this is my point here. This imitation is occurring on such a kind of microscopic sort of event that even that level of articulation is being shifted. Okay, and we don't shift a lot. I'm not going to end up saying posh spice like she says it. Hers is always going to be delayed. Her vocal folds are always going to be delayed a little bit more than mine. And you know, even if she starts moving towards mine, but the shifts are minute. And in fact, they're only as much as 1/20th to 2/20ths of a second when people do this imitation. It's just a tiny shift each way. But what we do is we imitate this extent. Oh, I'm sorry, I actually misspoke. Okay, so hers might be 2/20th of a second naturally. Mine might be 1/20th of a second. We will imitate, so we move a little bit towards each other, and that movement is so tiny, it turns out to be 1/200th of a second. In other words, naturally, she says posh spice with 2/20ths of a second of a delay. I say posh spice with just 1/20th of a second delay. But then when we meet each other, we shift just a tiny bit, a tiny, tiny bit, but it's measurable and it can be very systematic, which is amazing. It's as if my speech articulators are imitating hers and her speech articulators are imitating mine with more precision than I could ever try intentionally to control. This is a reflex, and the reflex can be so nuanced that it's shifting just a tiny, tiny bit, but it's shifting enough to be measurable. Okay, so that's what I mean by too small to willfully control. Say, now Rosenblum, go ahead and pretend you're posh spice, and I could extend my P's, right? I can make that kind of voice onset time longer, but not with the precision of 1/200th of a second. Okay, I don't have the ability to intentionally control it like that. I can exaggerate it, right? Which, impersonation is often an exaggeration, right? But I cannot have that type of conscious control over it, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. So this is what got me into it. It's like, my gosh, when we're doing these speech imitations, we are really doing stuff at such a nuanced level that, what part of the brain could be involved with this? What, does this, when you do it like that, does it serve any purpose? Is there, some linguistic, is there some language-based purpose about these sort of things? Let's talk a little bit about that. But we're going to move away from speech, at least for the time being, and talk about some of the types of imitations we saw before during those sort of chameleon effect demonstrations. And the idea here is this, and you might have gotten a sense that we might be going in this direction based on that first discussion where we talked about students imitating professors and professors then maybe imitating students, that imitation, okay, even though it was unconscious, it was subtle, it was inadvertent, seemed to have some bearing on the rapport that people who participated in interactions where there was more imitation going on reported having a more successful interaction, better rapport with the person. And that's what the research shows, that imitation can actually, to some degree, facilitate social interactions. Right. So we were talking about if this imitation is so pervasive, if it happens so much, again, at an unconscious, inadvertent, subtle, kind of inconspicuous level, but it happens in so many different contexts and seems to happen reflexively. Does it have a purpose? And maybe this is one of the purposes. It might facilitate social interactions. So back to this experiment. Remember this one? We're going to kind of switch it up now. It's conducted by the same lab, but here's what we're going to do. Where it's going to be a confederate, again, and a naive subject doing the exact same task. They're going to be looking at pictures, describing pictures to each other, so that the person might then be able to draw it later on. Okay. So you're going to concentrate on being, doing a good job with this and being detailed on this. And now the Confederate, rather than kind of initiating a new action that they'll then see if the naive subject imitates, the Confederate is going to do some imitation of the naive subject's normal behaviors. So as you can see there, that's Alan Alda, that naive subject, as he's describing the pictures, is doing this type of thing. The Confederate now, that woman, okay, will, when it's her turn, maybe do a tiny bit of this type of motion. Okay. Again, inconspicuously, in the sense that it's not like the sort of, kind of very glaring imitation you did with your siblings, or they do on Saturday Night Live. They don't do the, the kind of, the extreme mannerisms of Joe Biden or whatever, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about very subtle sorts of things that are delayed a little bit. At the very end of it, depending on if you were in the group of naive subjects that was imitated versus in a group of naive subjects that was not imitated, what is your feeling about the interaction? And as it turns out, the group of subjects that were imitated in this subtle, kind of delayed way will consider the interaction more successful than the group of subjects that was not imitated in this way. Okay. So being imitated in this context makes you think the interaction is more successful. Oh, I forgot to mention this too. It also makes you like the person better. So they are also asked that. So the subjects at the very end were asked, did you like your, they were never, I think at this point, told that there was a Confederate. It wasn't until after the questionnaire. Did you like the person you interacted with? And they would say they liked the person more if the person had been, doing this imitation. Did you consider the interaction successful? They would think that it was a more successful interaction if the person was doing a little bit of this imitation. Okay. Then finally, they'd say, okay, did you realize that that person imitated you a little bit? And again, people would say, no, I liked them. They weren't imitating me. I would have noticed. Say, no, they actually were doing a little imitation. You just didn't notice. They had been trained to do a little imitation. They were part of the experiment. They were trained to do a little imitation. And we wondered if you noticed it all. No, I didn't even know this person wasn't another naive subject like me, right? So again, unconscious in this case, but the person is not aware of being imitated. And as long as that's the case, they typically like this person better and they think the interaction is more successful. What else? This sort of methodology where there's a Confederate involved and somebody is being imitated has shown other sorts of benefits for a social kind of connection. So it turns out that being imitated a little bit like this facilitates agreement. There's evidence that waitresses that do a little of this kind of, kind of imitation, whether it's speech imitation or body language imitation of customers, will typically get larger tips. It enhances product enjoyment. So what does that involve? And I should mention some of this research now, you can imagine, is going to be relevant to organizational psychology, where maybe salespeople are trained to get people to like a product or something like that. And that is something that is done. So these would be in like the context of a sample table at Costco or at a grocery store or something like that, and somebody would come around and say, oh, can I try a sample? Please do. And then the person would start talking. The person who was giving out the samples would start talking to the person, and the more, as they're going back and forth in the discussion, the more the salesperson, the person giving the samples, imitates subtly the motion, the body language, the speech pattern of the person taking the sample, the more the person taking the sample says they like the sample. Okay, so there's evidence that it subtly enhances product enjoyment, and it is sometimes the sort of thing that folks who are salespeople in this kind of context will be trained to do to some degree. It's not something, it's probably, kind of better as some sort of byproduct of just an engaged salesperson, right? You don't want to get the person to imitate the other, the customer to the extent that they're aware of being imitated. That's for certain. It's got to be subtle, it should be delayed a little bit, but it seems to work. Finally, in terms of this, kind of sales and organizational psychology, if in fact you can set up an avatar, like, someday we'll all be interacting on Zoom with, people with programs that work at the airlines that are really just avatars. And I think they use this in Japan. I think this is kind of a big thing now, where you interact over the computer, not just with a voice, but with a character, a nicely rendered, human likeness. It's clearly, I've seen these, it's clearly an animation, but it's not unpleasant to look at. They find that if they can somehow get the avatar to imitate the customer, that the customer finds the interaction a little better. Okay, so it enhances avatar likability. That's what that's showing below. That's some very early research on this sort of thing. So if your camera's on, and I'm not sure everyone's going to feel comfortable with their camera on talking to an avatar, that's working for the airlines or something, working for the airlines, that they can record your motion as you're talking, they can record your facial expressions as you're talking, and then the avatar can be programmed to do the same type of thing. Even if that doesn't occur, since it is a voice recognition system, the avatar can speak back with the same sort of intonations. And it does seem to enhance avatar likability on the part of the customer. It does seem to work like that. Okay. Importantly, in all these examples, the imitation needs to be delayed a little bit. It needs to be subtle. It needs to be smooth. This is not like your siblings imitating you when you were a kid. It is very subtle. It has to be done in a way that is not conspicuous. Okay? If it is conspicuous, it's not effective at all. Okay, so whether it's the avatar that's going to imitate your vocal intonation a little bit, okay, or the person in the experiment, the Confederate in the experiment, who's going to be imitating your body language, it has to be delayed. It can't be immediate. It has to be maybe 30 seconds later, as an example. It has to be smooth, so it seems like it's coming naturally out of what they're doing. Okay, and it can't be exaggerated. It has to be subtle. All right. But it goes beyond this. This is really kind of interesting. So it does get you to like the person you're interacting with more if they are in fact doing this kind of delayed, smooth, subtle imitation. But not only does it affect your perspective on the imitator, it actually generalizes to other things and potentially other people. So it's been shown in a number of different experiments, but say you go through this experiment now, this one here, where there's a Confederate imitating your behavior. And what happens now is you're not being interviewed yet or anything like that. You're saying, okay, could you go sit outside? And what we're going to do is we're going to give you your money. I guess everyone's paid in this experiment $5, $10 or something like that. And then so sit here with your money here's your money. Sit here for about 5 minutes, and we're going to come back and we're going to interview you and tell you what the experiment's about. All right. Now, here's an additional manipulation. The person has the money, they're sitting there with the money, 5 singles, and there's one of these boxes there on the table with them, and the box, says, please consider donating some of your subject money to the homeless or, a children's hospital or something like that. And the question is, will the person make a donation out of their 5 singles or 10 singles? Let's make it 10 singles. Will they take one of their singles and put it in the box? Will they be willing to donate? And you know where this is going. If you had just been in an experimental group where you had been imitated, you are more likely to make that donation than if you had been in an experiment where you had not been imitated. Okay, so imitation not only kind of makes you like the imitator better, it kind of makes your positive feeling towards the imitator generalize and makes you more basically altruistic in this sense. All right. Another example of this, and we've actually tried this in my lab. It takes some practice on the part of the experimenter. Okay, so you're in the experiment, back in the room. So we'll rewind the clock, and you're interacting with the person, and the person is doing the subtle imitation. You're not aware of it, but they're doing the subtle imitation, and then it's over. You say, okay, now we're going to separate you folks and give you your credit. We're going to interview each of you. So the Confederate leaves. You still don't know they're a Confederate, of course, and you sit there and wait. And about a minute later, somebody comes in that's holding a bunch of papers, and on top of it is, I think, 10 pencils that are sharpened, right? You know, as if they're bringing some materials in, right? And as they come into the room, they trip, and the pencils go everywhere, right? All right. By the way, we did this. We were hoping to find it. I won't tell you about the details of it. It didn't work very well, but it took a long time for us to train our experimenters to do this. In fact, what we ended up, because it just didn't look real. You know, I mean, you're walking in with this, and you have to be a fairly, you know, experienced mime or actor to be able to, you know, kind of look natural in dropping the pencils. So we decided to do it this way. If we ever do it again, we'll probably use the same thing. As the person's walking in, they pretend they're getting a text message on their phone. So they pick up their phone and look at their phone, and then the pencils drop. And that worked really well, actually. By then, it worked really well. And the pencils go all over the floor near where the subject is sitting. Cool. Okay, so we got that down. The question is, will they help the experimenter pick up the pencils? So the experimenter goes, oh, shoot, and puts the phone down and starts to bend over and get the pencils. They are certainly within easy reach of this naive subject. Will they help the pencils? Will they help the experimenter pick up the pencils? And they know it's an experimenter, so still, will they help? And you know where we're going with this. This is what I call, just very simply, the pencil dropping experiment. If they have been imitated, if they have been subtly imitated, they are more likely to help with the pencils than if they have not been subtly imitated. In other words, this subtle imitation, again, not only, you know, makes you like the person who imitated you more, but it makes you kind of more altruistic. You're in a state that makes you want to help people, whether it's donate a little money to this you know, foundation, or to, you know, help somebody pick up pencils. It does seem to work pretty well, okay, which is pretty interesting. All right, so yes, it does seem that there's some evidence that this imitation, when you are imitated, it does seem to, you know, kind of enhance your altruism a bit and your feelings towards the interaction and the other person. Right? But imitation actually also enhances you on a more fundamental level. It makes you a better perceiver. And this is where we're going to get a little bit more technical. I think a lot of people find this kind of social psychology imitation stuff pretty intuitive. It's going to get a little technical here, but I think you'll be able to follow it with not much work. We're talking about the fact that, you know, by imitative practice, you actually improve your ability to perceive. Remember, that's one of the big stories in the book, right? You become a better wine drinker, you become a better, you know, listener, you know, all these sorts of things, about a smeller with practice, all right? But here we're talking about a specific type of practice, imitative practice, okay? In a way, I think we have intuitions about this. So, you know, if you are, in fact, learning a sport, and one way you learn a sport is to imitate a teacher or imitate a friend who knows the sport a little bit better, right? With that experience, when you then watch that sport on TV, you can pick out more. You can see more of the kind of subtleties of a golf swing or of a baseball bat swing or something like that, a swimming stroke or something like that, right? And so you learn to become better at this skill, you know, kind of physically yourself through this imitative practice. You are then able to see a little bit more than you used to see when you watch it on TV. And that's not only true of sports, it's also true of music. You know, if you're learning an instrument, you start to hear people when you hear recordings of people playing that instrument, you hear more than you used to, right? You hear nuances that you didn't hear before. And I think those are kind of just simple anecdotes that suggest that, you know, with practice yourself, with your own practice of a skill, you become a better perceiver at this skill. Okay, it's fine. Those are kind of intuitive anecdotes. But this has also been shown in the lab, and shown in the lab in very, very idiosyncratic ways. Okay, very kind of finely designed ways to show that imitative practice does in fact make you a better perceiver. Especially if we're talking about this motor training. So yeah, learning a new sport is a motor training thing, and learning a new instrument is a motor training thing. It enhances our perceptual skill. Okay, so look, think about this. You're in an experiment, you sit down on a chair, it's more like I guess a stool, you know, so your legs are kind of dangling a tiny bit, and yet there's no back to it, which is kind of the more important thing. And you are sitting across from an experimenter and say, okay, we are going to teach you a little dance that you're just going to do with your arms. And so the person says, okay, watch me do this. And the person's dance is weird. Okay, so the experimenter ends up kind of swinging their arms kind of at a weird, with a weird relationship to each other. Can you see, I could do this, or I could do this. That's a good dance, right? But I'm doing this. Okay, so it's not like they're completely out of phase, or they're completely out of phase, or they're completely in phase. It's somewhere in between. Okay? So I'm doing this, and the experimenter is really good at it. They practiced for, you know, months or weeks at least. And the subject says, okay, I'll try my best at that. And, you know, they do it for a little while. They do it for about an hour, I believe, something like that. Okay, we keep watching. Good. Now you just practice it on your own. You're doing good. Practice it on your own without watching me. And I'll tell you if you're you know, continuing to do a good job. And they do. They, for maybe, you know, another half hour or something like that. Maybe it's a little long, maybe 15 more minutes or something like that. See, cool. Okay. You are done now with that part of the experiment. The next part of the experiment is going to involve you doing a visual test. We're going to ask you to look at some actions that are rendered very oddly. You're not going to, you know, they're going to be videos, and they're going to be videos of people, but you'll see the videos are very odd. Do I have this here? Oh, shoot. Yeah. Let me go ahead. I hope this is working. So sorry. Should have checked this out before. I forgot this video was on. Okay, these are movies of actors who have points, little points of light kind of on the major joints of their body. So if I clicked this video, you would see the points move around, and the points would move around. And once they started, you would say, hey, these are people. Okay. And so in other words, they are basically just points moving, white points moving against a dark background, but you can tell a lot from them. For example, you could tell if a person is walking across the screen very easily. You say, yeah, I'm seeing points, and I know the points are probably on their elbow and their wrist and shoulder and hip and knee and ankle, but they're people. I can absolutely see them. Okay, and your job is to look at pairs of these I guess you could say point light people, right? Point light people walking across the screen, and just saying, okay, you're going to see one after the other and tell us whether or not they're walking in the same way. Okay, so you see one go by walking, another go by walking. Those two people that you just saw, are they walking in the same way? So yeah, I think so. All right, good. You understand the task now. Now we're going to make it a little trickier by showing you these points of people walking, but they're going to be walking a little strangely. Okay. In fact, they're going to be walking. I mean, we actually created these not by filming people. These are actually made by computer, right? These are animated points. You know, still kind of looks like a person, but now the person kind of looks drunk, right? And so, you know, you see them kind of walking like this, something like that, walking across the screen, and then you see another one, and the question is, was this the same walking, or is this two different types of walking? It's tough now. And you wouldn't be great at it because, you know, the walking is now really complicated. You would only be good at it when those little point light walkers were shown walking in the same manner that your little dance was constructed. So when you did this dance, this little arm dance thing. The experimenter was very certain that the relationship, what we call the phase relationship between the arms, was very constant. Okay, now it's not normal. This is not normally how we swing our arms, nor is it normally how we walk. But you became an expert with your motor system at performing this specific phase relation. So it's not, this is again, this would be in phase, this would be completely out of phase, 180 degrees out of phase. Maybe it's 120 degrees out of phase or something that's not normal. But you became an expert at it by moving your own limbs. And it allowed you to become an expert at it when it comes to being able to see these kind of drunk point light walkers, either walking, the same way twice or different. You became an expert at a particular style, perceiving a particular style of walking based on your own practice. Okay, suggesting again that the imitative learning of this then allowed you to become a better perceiver. You learned to do this through imitation and became an expert through your own practice, and then allowed you to see something that you couldn't see before. I mean, the nice thing is kind of a crazy experiment. Why would you ever go to so much trouble doing something like this? Well, you just want to make sure that it is in fact imitative practice, and not just you're watching a lot of tennis now and you know what a good tennis stroke looks like. You want to make sure it's something so weird that you would have no other experience with it, right? That there's no other context in which you would see people walking like this, so you can pinpoint, yep, it was that experience that made them a better perceiver when it came to that. And there's all the correct control conditions that some people are trained with, 120 degrees out of phase. Some people are trained with 70 degrees out of phase, and those are the only ones that they become better at perceiving. Okay, so yes, it absolutely works. What else? How else do we know this is important? Well, I'm gonna go back to faces a tiny bit here, and talk about imitation. Okay. Okay, remember we talked about this with regard to faces, right? Oh yeah, yeah, oh yeah, this is great. Covert, yeah. Blinded by Botox. This is one of my favorite examples because I have a friend who does Botox regularly. So you might know about this. People, to get rid of wrinkle lines, they get Botox injections. You may have heard about this sort of thing. I think they still do this. I think my friend still does it. So she has, it's a woman, she has Botox injections up here in her brow, and I think in her cheeks and around her mouth, she says, and she has it done every once in a while. She feels better for doing it. I mean, I think, I don't know if I notice a difference, but, if it helps her, more power to her, that's fine. I remember her, describing what this thing was, what it was like and how she felt. And she said, sometimes I feel like when I move my face, when I smile, I'm not quite smiling enough and stuff. And I don't really notice a difference, but yeah, I guess that would make sense, because what it does, I guess, is temporarily paralyze part of the muscle or something like that. So she doesn't have that movement in her face. Okay, I can imagine that's the case. And I imagine, you could take a picture of her smiling before and after, and maybe you'd see more of an extreme smile before she had the Botox injections. That makes sense. What maybe is a little surprising is not only are her own expressions changed a little from having these Botox injections, her perception of other people's expressions are a little changed by virtue of having these Botox injections. And I told her about this, and she said, that is crazy. So I said, yeah. So I was going out to dinner with her, and I said, so you might know now I'm smiling now, if if it's a subtle smile. And she said, I can tell you. She's absolutely right. These are subtle changes, but it's so interesting that not only does it affect her face and how she moves her face, it affects her visual perception of other people's faces. And this is what the research shows. So people who had Botox were shown a series of faces. I should make sure I convey this is very subtle differences that we're talking here. And so they, imagine having a smiling face on one hand and having a frowning, the same person making a frowning face on the other. So my face smiling, my face frowning, okay? So you take those two and then you use, some of this fancy pants software and you kind of, make images in between that kind of interpolate between the smile and the frown. So you have a continuum from smile to frown. Okay, does that make sense? And so you got like 7, or let's make it 9. And some of these are kind of hard to tell. So you look at the ones kind of in the middle and it's kind of hard to know, does that kind of look like a smile? Does that look like a frown? And maybe even more importantly, when they get kind of close together, it's kind of hard to even tell them apart. Okay, so here's what happens. You show these kind of images that are next to each other to somebody before they've had the Botox injection. And they're able to say whether it's the same image or they're 2 different images. So sometimes they actually would be showing the same image. Sometimes they would be showing the same image. Sometimes they would be showing the ones that are next to each other. But because they're so subtly different, it's hard. So you first do it with people before their Botox, and they're able to do it fairly well. You then do it with people, a few weeks after they've gotten the injection. They are less able to see those very subtle distinctions in expression between the 2 faces. Certainly they can say, this is Rosenblum smiling, this is Rosenblum frowning, that's not a problem. And they, if you showed them pictures that were, say 2 or 3 images apart, okay, this one more on the smiling side, this one more on the front side. Oh yeah, I see the difference. But when they're right next to each other and there's very subtle differences, the fact my friend had Botox makes it more difficult for her to see the subtle differences in expression. You don't have to do this with Botox, by the way. If you want to do this to your friends without forcing them to get Botox, you can do some other things. You can constrain their own faces by having them put a pen in their teeth or in their lips. And what that's doing is just kind of, occupying the facial muscles a little bit. You are restricting the normal imitative kind of muscular response that we talked about before, right? And the same thing will happen. People are not as good at kind of picking out very subtle differences in emotion. If in fact their own face is constrained by biting on a pencil or by having Botox injected into their facial muscles. So you're restricting this kind of, reflexive, very subtle imitation in the people's own expressions, and it's affecting how they're able to perceive others. Other examples of this, leg and body motions. Okay, so in this experiment, it's much better than Botox. It's much less intrusive. You're sitting on a stool again. Actually, it's more, I think they have you sit on a high table because they're going to want you to swing your legs later. Anyway, before you have to do that, you're looking at a series of images, pairs of images, and you're asked to say, is this person, in the same posture, just from 2 different angles? That's photographed from 2 different angles, right? So is this exactly the same posture as this? And I think in this case it is. Is that right? Yeah. So, but it could be subtly different. So maybe this person's back foot is angled forward in one of these images and to the side in the other, right? So it's hard. I mean, it can be a tough one to determine. But it's basically, are these the same postures this person is performing, or is there something different in the 2 postures you're seeing from these 2 different perspectives? And, people can do it. That's challenging. But here's now the critical manipulation. While they're doing it, you have one group of subjects continue the task, but start moving their arm back and forth kind of just in a relaxed way. Just you're biding your time. You're kind of just, relaxed and just moving your arm back and forth just a little bit. Is that movement of your body going to affect how you perceive these postures in the task? And the answer is yes. And in fact, it's going to happen in a very, very specific way. In fact, you're going to make more mistakes determining whether these 2 images are the same or different, of the same posture or different postures. But it's going to affect your ability to look at the details in the arms if, in fact, you're swinging your own arm. And now there's another group of subjects that's not swinging their arm. They're sitting on this table and they're swinging their lower leg back and forth, you know, like you do sometimes when you're getting a little antsy. And they're doing the same task. And they also have more trouble than the group that's just sitting there still, a little bit more trouble. And guess where their trouble lies? They have trouble determining whether the postures are the same or different, depending on whether the legs are the same or different. They're fine to determine whether the hands are the same or the arms are the same or different. But they do have trouble determining whether the leg postures are the same or different if they are moving their legs. So what it suggests is that your own motor system influences how you perceive in a body system specific way, right? In a way that seems to depend on what part of our bodies are actually engaged in the motor behavior, in the motion. When you're moving your arms, you're not as good at judging other people's arm positions. When you're moving your legs, you're not as good at judging other people's legs position. If your face is occupied, you're not as good at recognizing facial expressions, whether it's occupied by Botox or occupied by a pen in your mouth. Okay. Now, again, let me make sure we're clear here. You know, it's not like you all of a sudden lose the ability to recognize arm positions completely while you're moving your arm. These are subtle differences, but the fact that, you know, we've historically thought that the motor system is kind of, you know, if your motor system is just kind of doing something that's, you know, kind of not related to what you're actually supposed to be perceiving or something, we wouldn't think there'd be any influence, but there is. Your motor system seems to be part of your perceptual system overall and affect it in that way. Okay, it's really interesting. Okay, good place for a tiny little break, and then we'll continue and get a little bit more technical. But let's do a question. More faces, I think. Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, we learned this today, though, so it should be very simple. About faces and personality. Why might your face fit your personality? Okay, why might your face? And we talked about this in the beginning of class today. Why might your face fit your personality? A, because of self-fulfilling prophecy. Remember, we discussed that today. We also discussed B, expressive habits. So that's another answer. C is the answer. Oh, it should say both A and B. I apologize. The answer to C should say both A and B, not B and C. That's kind of silly. Or D, none of the above. So when you read this question, when you go down to C, it's supposed to say both A and B. Both this is how it, okay? Self-fulfilling prophecy and expressive habits, if you think that's the answer. Make sure that's correct on the test. Great. Another 10 seconds or so. Cool. Perfect again. Wow, you folks are smart. The correct answer is both A and B. So C is the one to mark. Yes, self-fulfilling prophecy, the idea that if your face has a certain look to it, maybe when you were young, people will approach you in a specific way, and that will affect your personality, and that your personality kind of grows into your appearance. Expressive habits is another explanation, and that is that your face is, you know, basically consider your face like a muscle that can be exercised, and the more your expressions, the more expressions of one type you have, the more your face will be exercised in that direction, and that can be something that is potentially visible when your neutral face is seen. Okay, so that is the correct answer, C, which is supposed to be both A and B. Great, terrific. You're geniuses. Okay, let's continue with this, and here's going to get a tiny bit more technical. Cool. So we're going to kind of continue with this idea of constraining things and to see if it affects, or constraining or motor behavior, or the muscles that are involved in the motor behavior, to see if it has an influence on perception. But actually, we're going to go deeper than the muscles. We're actually going to go to the part of your brain that's involved in kind of initiating, kind of sending out the commands for motor behaviors. So the idea here, and this is kind of a continuation of the last slide, that we use our motor system to perceive. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to kind of manipulate the motor parts of the brain that we know should have an effect over your motor behavior, have an effect over your coordination, have an effect over, how you move a finger, how you move a limb. But will those changes also affect how you perceive? Okay, so how do we do this? Well, we bring in our best technical friend of the quarter, which is the transcranial magnetic stimulation device. There, you see it right there, the little Mickey Mouse ears, where you swing it around to different parts of the skull, and then turn it on so it imparts a little magnetic pulse to a specific region of the brain. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to swing the Mickey Mouse ears over to the side right here. Okay, remember I talked about this little strip down the side of the brain here, called the motor strip. It was like that sensory strip, but here this is a strip that's going to be involved in actually initiating different actions in the body, right? So you stimulate this part right here directly. You put a little sensor into the brain right there, and it is going to induce a movement in the hand or something like that. But we're not going to dig into the brain, okay? We're going to do this all from the outside, but you can be pretty precise on the part of the motor strip that is affected. And so you can map this out fairly easily. So you kind of swing it around to a very specific spot on the motor strip, and you push the button, and you see what part of the body moves. And it's typically it's not a kind of a graceful movement. It's kind of just like a little twitch like that, like the arm moves. And I say, okay, I must be at the arm part, and that makes sense given what we know about the map anyway. Yep, okay, we're at the arm part, and we know we're just affecting now the motor strip. There's nothing here. I mean, the visual system is way back here as far as we understand it, right? So there's nothing that should directly affect the visual system. However, when in fact you do kind of temporarily lesion, kind of break temporarily that little part of the brain, right? What you end up finding is that people's perceptions change. So let's bring it to the face area of the little motor strip here. And you make sure it's the face area because you put it out there and you do a tiny little pulse and somebody moves their face, the subject moves their face. But again, it sounds a lot creepier than it is. I've been in these experiments, and it kind of feels more like a little twitch, a little reflex or something like that, and it stops immediately. But they do it. Your face moves, and I say, okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of induce a little bit of a stronger pulse. So we kind of basically shut off that part of your brain just for a second. And they do it. And, if you would now have a little trouble moving your face in complex ways, but that's not really the important part. The part that we're interested in is whether this affects your perception of other people's faces. And what you find is, yeah, this is another way. If you want to, stop somebody from having an easy time with facial emotion, you can do this. And by the way, I should mention, I think these effects are larger than the Botox effects. I think you'd still be able to distinguish a happy face from a sad face, but now you're going to have some trouble with those faces that are in between, more so than if you had Botox or you had a pen in your mouth or something like that. And again, the thing is over here, the TMS wand is over here, not at the visual system, at the motor system. But now we're disrupting the motor system and finding, in some surprising way, that the visual system is actually affected. It's been done with a lot of different sorts of demonstrations. Now, adjust it a tiny bit, so you're no longer over the face motor system, but now you're over the arm motor system. And You make sure that you're there because the subject just twitches a little bit, and now you turn it on full blast so it kind of shuts it off just for a temporary minute or so, and now have them watch people, say, lifting weight. Watch them lifting, have them watch videos of people lifting weight, and the subjects are no longer able to distinguish, whether this movement is of a heavier weight than this movement, where before they had their own motor system shut down for a brief period, they could do. So disrupting the motor system disrupts the perceptual system, which back, we're talking about, 2008, 2009, that was really surprising that you could actually affect visual perception by disrupting a person's motor brain, as well as all these other ways of occupying the motor system. Again, to think of the visual system, the perceptual system as involving the motor system was really pretty revolutionary about that, okay? By the way, I should mention that it's not like it's affecting, your ability to recognize hands or recognize arms or anything like that. You can certainly recognize what you're looking at. You say that's a person whose hand is holding a weight and they're lifting a weight with their arm. That's not the problem. What they have problems doing is to determine the subtleties of the action. The subtleties of the action. So that's what that phrase right there says, that it's not an issue of just recognizing body parts. It doesn't have that type of an effect. It has an effect over perceiving another person's actions. Okay, we will continue. Oh boy, I didn't see the chat. I'm so sorry. Quickly, let's see. Oh, okay, this had to do with somebody's camera on. Oops, okay, I won't get involved with that. Hopefully everything worked out. All right. Thanks, everyone. I will see you on Thursday for our last class.